Welcome back to another journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we drift across the cold waters of the North Sea, where Viking longships carried their crews into a slow descent into madness. Picture, if you will, a wooden vessel barely 60 feet long, carrying 30 men across endless gray waters. For months at a time, these warriors would find themselves trapped in what would become a floating prison of the mind. Tonight, we explore not the glorious raids or heroic battles you might expect, but the quiet psychological torment that unfolded during those long, monotonous months at sea. The gradual unraveling of the human spirit, one wave at a time. Let us begin with the ship itself. The famous Viking Longship, celebrated in stories and songs. But strip away the romance and you'll discover something quite different. These vessels were marvels of engineering, yes, but they were also floating wooden boxes barely wide enough for a man to lie down. The typical longship measured perhaps 4 feet across at its widest point. Imagine 30 grown men, each accustomed to the freedom of Nordic forests and fjords, now pressed together like cargo. The ship had no proper sleeping quarters, no privacy, no escape from the constant presence of your fellow warriors. Day after day, week after week, the same faces, the same voices, the same complaints echoing in the confined space. The deck was slippery with seawater and fish scales, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the sour tang of fermented fish. Every breath was a reminder of your imprisonment, and the noise, oh, the constant noise, the creaking of wood under stress, the rhythmic splash of oars, the endless conversation that slowly devolved into meaningless chatter. Some men would begin to hear voices in the wind, whispers from the waves themselves. The human mind, you see, requires variety, stimulation, change. But life aboard a Viking longship offered none of these luxuries. Each day began the same way. Before dawn, men would wake to the gentle rocking that never ceased. The same gray sky, the same endless water stretching to the horizon, the same routine of checking the sail, adjusting the oars, scanning for land that never appeared. Meals were a particular form of torture. The same dried fish, day after day. The same hard bread that had to be soaked in seawater to become edible. The same sour ale that grew more bitter with each passing week. Men would count the waves. 1, 2, 3, trying to find patterns in the endless procession of water. Some would begin to see faces in the foam, dragons in the clouds, islands that weren't really there. The strongest warriors, men who had faced berserkers in battle without flinching, would find themselves reduced to tears by the simple sight of another seabird, because it meant, perhaps, that land was near. Time itself became fluid, without the markers of sunrise and sunset that made sense on land. Days blended into an endless gray twilight. Was it morning? Afternoon? Had they been sailing for weeks or months? In their homeland, each Viking warrior had an identity, a name that carried weight, a family, a reputation, But the sea has a way of washing such things away. Stripped of their familiar surroundings, these men began to lose track of who they were. Without the daily rituals of home, without the seasonal markers that gave meaning to their lives, they became simply bodies in a boat. Personal hygiene became impossible. Hair grew wild and matted. Beards became tangled with salt and seaweed. The proud appearance of a Norse warrior dissolved into something less human. Language itself began to deteriorate. Complex conversations gave way to grunts and gestures. The poetry and storytelling that Vikings prized so highly reduced to simple, repetitive phrases. How far? When will we? I see. Some men would begin to forget their own names, their own histories, the details of their lives on land becoming as distant as the shore they'd left behind. They would stare at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. The social hierarchy that governed Viking society began to crumble. Jarls and thralls, nobles and commoners. Such distinctions meant nothing when everyone was equally miserable, equally reduced to their most basic needs. And then the voices would begin. Not the voices of shipmates, but something else. Something that seemed to come from the water itself. At first, just a whisper, easily dismissed as wind through the rigging. But as the weeks stretched on, the whispers became clearer, more persistent. Some men claimed to hear their wives calling to them from beneath the waves. Others heard the voices of fallen comrades, or gods, or demons. The boundary between sleep and waking became blurred. Men would find themselves having conversations with people who weren't there, responding to questions that hadn't been asked, laughing at jokes that existed only in their minds. The concept of sea madness wasn't unknown to the Vikings. They had words for it. Sjösot, the seasickness that went beyond the stomach, that infected the mind itself. Some warriors would begin to believe they were already dead, that the ship was carrying them to Valhalla or to some darker afterlife. They would sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing, waiting for their eternal fate to be revealed. Others would become convinced that they were transforming into sea creatures or spirits. They would study their hands, searching for signs of scales or gills or other mutations that existed only in their deteriorating minds. Every crew had a breaking point. That moment when the accumulated stress and isolation finally shattered someone's mind completely. It might begin with something small, a dispute over the last piece of bread, a disagreement about which direction to row. But in the pressure cooker of the Longship, small conflicts exploded into something much larger. Men who had sworn brotherhood would find themselves at each other's throats, literally, fighting over space, over food, over imagined slights that grew enormous in their confined world. Some would simply stop rowing, stop eating, stop responding to their names. They would curl up in the bottom of the boat and wait for what they couldn't say. The smart captains learned to recognize the signs, the vacant stares, the compulsive counting, the conversations with the dead. They would try to intervene, to redirect the madness, but sometimes it was too late. There are accounts of men throwing themselves overboard, not from despair, but from a genuine belief that they could swim home, or that the sea spirits were calling them to join their underwater kingdom. The surviving crew members would have to continue their journey, sharing the confined space with the memory of their lost comrades, wondering if they, too, were losing their grip on reality.
Those who survived the journey, who managed to hold on to their sanity, would eventually see something on the horizon. A dark line that slowly resolved into cliffs, trees, the blessed sight of solid ground. But the return to land brought its own challenges. Men who had lived for months in a world of endless motion would find themselves unable to walk straight. The ground seemed to rock beneath their feet. They would reach for railings that weren't there. More troubling still, many found they could no longer tolerate enclosed spaces. The very halls and houses they had longed for during their voyage now felt suffocating, oppressive. They would spend their first nights on shore sleeping under the open sky. Some never fully recovered. They would be found months later sitting by the water's edge, staring at the waves, as if waiting for something or someone to emerge from the depths. The successful Viking raids we read about in history books, the gold and silver and slaves, all of this came at a cost that the sagas rarely mention. The cost paid in human minds, in sanity, in the quiet madness that followed these warriors home. And so, the next time you picture a Viking longship cutting through the waves, remember that inside that vessel, brave men were slowly losing themselves, one wave at a time, one endless day at a time. The sea, it seems, always demands its payment, not just in storms and shipwrecks, but in the gradual erosion of the human spirit, wave by wave, until nothing remains but the memory of who you used to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of Viking history. If you enjoyed this exploration of the human cost of Norse expansion, you might also enjoy our other videos on medieval life. Until next time, sleep well.